Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. Once again, I'm going to talk about superheroes and comics. These are just the things I'm passionate about. I make no apologies and I have no regrets. I also believe they're worth talking about, especially with how superhero media has become such a big part of the pop culture zeitgeist. And one of the ways it became so big was with these big, bold stories that redefined what superheroes could be. And some of the boldest, most dramatic stories involve superheroes clashing with one another. But whenever superheroes fight other superheroes, things tend to get messy. Sometimes in a good way, but mostly in a not so good way. It's been happening in some form or another for decades, going all the way back to the golden age of comics in the 40s and 50s. But those clashes were mostly gimmicks and one-offs. It really wasn't until the early 2000s that these kinds of stories evolved into something so much more. For a while, superhero versus superhero battles were among the most popular trends in comics. And a lot of that was due to the unprecedented success of Marvel's Civil War, an event that pitted Iron Man against Captain America in a bitter dispute over superhero accountability. Now, I've talked about that story before, but it's still hard to overstate just how impactful it was when it first came out. I would even go so far as to say that modern superhero comics wouldn't be what they are now without Civil War. It was such a profound story that it eventually manifested in the Marvel Cinematic Universe with Captain America Civil War. Eventually, DC Comics followed suit with Batman v Superman. Now, many may argue the merits and quality of those movies, but there's no denying the drama and spectacle they created. Like it or not, the stakes are much higher when two iconic characters like Captain America and Iron Man clash. Much more so than when Captain America clashes with the Red Skull, or when Iron Man clashes with Ironmonger. When done well, these kinds of struggles can make for some truly incredible experiences. But unfortunately, stories about superheroes fighting other superheroes are rarely done well. If anything, they're much more prone to failing spectacularly, often becoming a joke, a failed gimmick, or even a cautionary tale. And that brings me to Avengers vs. X-Men, a superhero clash that was billed as Marvel's biggest event in a decade. It pitted Marvel's two most iconic franchises against one another in a battle for the future of the Marvel Universe as we knew it. To say this story was heavily hyped would be an Omega-level understatement. I've been reading comics for decades, and I can attest that Avengers vs. X-Men was one of the most heavily hyped stories of all time. But, spoiler alert, it didn't exactly deliver. Now, I know that's just an opinion to some extent. I don't deny that I have my criticisms and biases, especially when it comes to assessing stories like this, but I wouldn't call that sentiment a minority opinion. Ask most veteran comic book fans about Avengers vs. X-Men, and chances are you'll get plenty of diverse responses. Most do agree that it was an ambitious but flawed endeavor, one that started off exciting, but ultimately faltered in the end. On top of that, it was a story that divided the fans in a very different way compared to Civil War. Sure, Avengers vs. X-Men was a bold spectacle, but its various shortcomings and failures have caused that spectacle to age very poorly. And as someone who followed that story from start to finish, as well as everything that led up to it, I want to use this video to break down some of those chaotic details. I also want to make the point that, in the grand scheme of things, nobody truly won the Avengers vs. X-Men battle. But within this same story, there are plenty of hard lessons to glean for the Avengers, the X-Men, and superhero comics in general. To understand the larger spectacle of Avengers vs. X-Men, it's also necessary to understand the main catalyst behind it. Because in general, superheroes just don't fight each other for the sake of fighting. Otherwise, they wouldn't be heroes in the first place. To get them to fight at this scale, there had to be an underlying cause. And that cause came at the culmination of another major crossover event from earlier in the decade, House of M. It was another major event in the mid-2000s that rocked the world of superhero comics. Now, I won't go into every detail as to why it was such a big deal. I'll save that for another video. All you need to know is that the ending to that story helped set the stage for Avengers vs. X-Men. And it all came down to three fateful words uttered by Wanda Maximoff. No more mutants. That's what she said before casting a spell that warped reality on a massive scale. And the results of that spell was devastating for the mutant population. Suddenly, over 95% of all mutants were permanently depowered. It didn't outright kill them, but it effectively cut out a core part of who they were. They weren't tempered, they weren't briefly suppressed, they were just completely nullified, akin to flipping off a light switch and then ripping the socket out of the wall. Suddenly, mutants were no longer the next stage in human evolution. They were now an endangered species. No more mutants were manifesting their powers. No more mutants were being born. When the Scarlet Witch said those words, she effectively doomed an entire race. It put the X-Men and their entire cause into a precarious state. They were no longer fighting to protect a world that hated and feared them. They were just fighting to survive. For years after House of M, that was their greatest struggle. At one point, the entire mutant race was reduced to just 198 individuals. Now, during that time, the Avengers were still allies. They did attempt to help the X-Men during this difficult time. Now granted, that effort was complicated by other devastating events, such as Dark Reign and Secret Invasion, but the Avengers were never obstacles to mutant survival. That began to change as the situation with mutants grew increasingly bleak. While Wanda Maximoff did go missing for a while, she eventually came back. And even though there were other complications to her actions, as depicted in the series Children's Crusade, she never really faced serious consequences for what she did. And it didn't help that the Avengers went out of their way to forgive her and help her become a hero again. You could say the X-Men's animosity towards Wanda was somewhat unwarranted, especially after learning what and who influenced her. But the fact still remained. They would always go the extra mile for her, but not for mutants. And that just never sat well with the X-Men. For that reason and plenty others, a clash with the Avengers became somewhat inevitable. Because throughout this tenuous time, the Avengers demonstrated time and again that if it came down to saving the mutant race or protecting one of their own, they would always choose protecting their own. That all finally came to a head when the Phoenix Force entered the picture. This is when a war between the Avengers and the X-Men went from inevitable to imminent. It's also where some other major complications enter the picture. Complications that would ensure that there would never be a true winner. In the lengthy history of Marvel Comics, there are only a handful of forces that can truly shake the foundations of its universe. And the Phoenix Force is definitely one of them. While it's an entity that often shows up in X-Men comics, its lore extends far beyond the world of mutants. As a cosmic being of creation and destruction, this is a creature whose presence always warrants plenty of concern. It can wipe out entire planets and billions of lives on the slightest of whims. While possessing Jean Grey in the original Phoenix Saga, it famously destroyed a star and a planet containing 5 billion alien beings. And yes, it's also a force of creation and resurrection. The problem is the destruction usually comes first. And those who wield its power often act as a catalyst to such destruction. Now, there are plenty of other complications surrounding this aspect of the Phoenix Force in general, but I'll get to that later. Because in the context of Avengers vs. X-Men, the Phoenix is the primary spark. It began with dire news from Nova that the Phoenix is back. And it's coming to Earth. Anything that's in its way, including entire planets, are being burned to cinder. Naturally, the Avengers are very concerned, and so are the X-Men. Like I said, they have a very personal history with the Phoenix Force. They know better than most what it's capable of. But those issues are further complicated by the presence of Hope Summers, aka the Mutant Messiah. Because while the Phoenix Force was the proverbial spark, Hope Summers is the special kindling. Years before this event, she became the first mutant born after House of M. Her story largely played out in a trilogy of major X-Men events, collectively known as the Messiah Trilogy. And, as a brief aside, I highly recommend that any X-Men fan or Marvel fan check out those stories. They were among the best X-Men comics of that era. But rather than go over the many elaborate details of that trilogy, I'll just spoil the most relevant facts for Avengers vs. X-Men. Hope Summers, now a teenager thanks to some time travel shenanigans, is capable of helping New Mutants manifest for the first time since House of M, albeit on a small scale. But her presence alone wasn't enough to undo Wanda's spell entirely. For that, she needed more power. And that's exactly what the Phoenix Force provides, even if it is the less than stable kind. And it's that tantalizing possibility, reversing Wanda's spell and saving the mutant race, that convinces the X-Men to see the Phoenix differently. Cyclops especially, who has already lost loved ones to the Phoenix Force, is its biggest believer. He even gains the benefit of foresight to justify that belief. In a prelude comic, X-Sanction, Cyclops gets a glimpse of an apocalyptic future, courtesy of Cable, his time-traveling son. Cable confirms that Hope is destined to be the host of the Phoenix. But in this dark future that he saw, the Avengers killed Hope Summers. And without Hope, the Phoenix decimated Earth. That both raises the stakes and clarifies the battle lines. If mutants are to have any future, along with an intact planet for that matter, the X-Men have to protect Hope Summers, even if it means going to war with the Avengers. Now, to be fair to the Avengers, they never set out to kill Hope Summers. They never threaten that, nor do they hint that it's necessary. They want to save the world too, but they don't have all the facts. They just know the Phoenix Force is coming to Earth, it's destroying everything in its path, and Hope Summers is its target. That lack of perspective creates an early imbalance in the conflict. But remember, the X-Men have seen the future. They know what happens. The Avengers may think they're trying to save the day, but their actions may end up dooming everyone. Even if that does help add plenty of additional tension to the ensuing battle, it also obscures the merits and motivations of each side, and it only gets more obscured when other complications enter the picture. Now, before I go any further, I want to make one thing clear about Avengers vs. X-Men. When it first began, it was genuinely exciting. Regardless of the setup or circumstances, fans really were eager to see how it played out. The very first issue went back for multiple reprintings. And I freely admit that it was the most excited I'd been for a comic in years. Hell, if I had to grade the first 4 issues of the event and its assorted tie-ins, I would give it an A+. The structure of the story was simple. The motivations for each side of the conflict were clear. And from there, it escalated into this heroes versus heroes brawl, unfolding across the planet and even into space. We saw Captain America fighting Cyclops. We saw Colossus fighting the Hulk. We even saw Storm fighting Black Panther, who she was married to at the time. I definitely commend the writers and artists for how they crafted these early issues. They were a lot of fun to follow. But once the spectacle gave way to the substance, things took a distinct turn. And that's where Avengers vs. X-Men began to unravel, as both a story and a concept. If there was a critical turning point, it happened when Iron Man came up with the brilliant idea to stop the Phoenix Force by shooting it with a giant gun. And sure, that sounds exactly like something Tony Stark would do. He makes weapons and he tries to solve problems with tech. It's objectively absurd, but at this point, the Avengers are desperate. And desperation tends to make for misguided decisions. It all came to a head on the moon, the same place where Jean Grey sacrificed herself when she couldn't contain the Phoenix Force. The Avengers and X-Men are fighting hard, trying to protect Hope as the Phoenix draws near. It's a harrowing scene, definitely the most intense of the story. Then, the Phoenix Force arrives and Iron Man fires the big gun. And that's where things get messy. For one, the gun didn't destroy the Phoenix. It's a cosmic entity known for resurrection. That was never going to be the outcome. Instead, the Phoenix Force was split into 5 pieces. And those pieces all inhabited the 5 X-Men battling on the moon. namely Cyclops, Emma Frost, Namor, Colossus, and Magic. Together, they became the Phoenix Five, sort of like a Green Lantern Corps, but with the Phoenix Force. They were all imbued with a fraction of its power. But even while divided, it's a lot of power, even by comic book standards. It effectively ended the ongoing Avengers vs. X-Men battle, albeit temporarily. But it also completely changed the nature of the story. Now imbued with all this cosmic power, the Phoenix Five set out to change the world in ways no superhero team has ever tried before. They seek to end large-scale geopolitical conflicts. They seek to fix parts of the world that are broken, regrowing the ice caps, turning deserts into lush fields, and plenty of other objectively good things. It's a hell of a turn. Given that their goal was to save the mutant race, it's more than a bit jarring. But it also completely reframes the earlier decisions of both the X-Men and the Avengers. Remember, the Avengers came to the X-Men demanding that they hand over Hope Summers, believing she was the key to driving the Phoenix Force away from Earth. The X-Men refused, believing she needed to be present so she could heal the mutant species. But when the Phoenix split, the nature of those decisions became largely an afterthought. Everything they thought they knew about the Phoenix was called into question. And beyond just being a major shift in the story, it also set the stage for more misguided decisions, this time from both sides. And it's here where Avengers vs. X-Men really collapses as a cohesive narrative. It's a common refrain throughout superhero media and heroes' journeys in general. Power corrupts. And absolute power corrupts absolutely. It's such a recurring mantra, right up there with great power and great responsibility. It was also very much at the core of the original Phoenix Saga and Uncanny X-Men. But that story worked because it didn't hide from the larger complexities surrounding power and corruption. Avengers vs. X-Men, on the other hand, well, it missed the point entirely. Around the midpoint of this story, the Phoenix Five are going strong. They're literally changing the world, and changing it for the better. Suddenly, the X-Men, and mutants as a whole, are laying a foundation for real, lasting peace. It's very much in line with their long-running efforts to promote peace and understanding in a world that hates and fears them. Now, they just happen to have the power to make it real. Yes, you could make the case that they're going about it all wrong. They're not using rhetoric, advocacy, or kindness to make these changes anymore. Now, they're taking more extreme measures, for their benefit and for everyone else's. That may still not sit well with many. Even so, you can't argue with results. And, like it or not, the Phoenix Five are delivering. More so than any superhero team has ever dared attempt. And that detail matters. It matters a lot, actually. Because it makes what the Avengers do next completely undermine their credibility within this conflict. Because while the Phoenix Five are doing their thing, Hope Summers is still with them. The Avengers, overwhelmed and licking their wounds, are anxious about how much change and upheaval they're seeing. They're not overlooking all the good they're doing. Their main concern is that this immense power will eventually corrupt the Phoenix Five. While that's not an unreasonable concern, it's how they go about addressing it that's so egregious. The Avengers ultimately decide, despite having multiple geniuses on their team, to attack the Phoenix Five. They don't try to talk to them first. They don't attempt to cooperate or coordinate. They just attack the Phoenix Five, attempt to abduct Hope Summers again, and order them to stop changing the world, even though they're doing a lot of good. Now, I need to take a step back for a moment and make one thing clear. This scene, this decision within the story, it makes no fucking sense. I remember first reading this issue. I honestly thought there was a page missing or something. There just had to be something else going on here. Something to make sense of the Avengers' decision. Because they couldn't be that fucking dumb. They're worried about the Phoenix corrupting their hosts, so they decide to attack and abduct the same person who triggered the conflict to begin with? Fictional world or not, how does that make a lick of sense? And how is that supposed to temper or mitigate the corrupting influence of the Phoenix Force? Those are not rhetorical questions, by the way. And they were never fully addressed in the story, or in the tie-in issues for that matter. There's just no way around it. The Avengers provoked the Phoenix Five and the Phoenix Force by default. In doing so, they can no longer blame the corrupting effects of power. They've only themselves to blame. They poked this cosmic firebird, and now they're blaming it for burning them? Not only is that the dumbest possible recourse, it paints them and heroes like them in a very negative light. It sends the message that they can't handle a world that's being fixed on a wide scale. They can't even imagine a world that doesn't need superhero teams to begin with. So they attack the source of it all, thereby reigniting the conflict and ensuring that it's going to have an ugly, unsatisfying ending. And make no mistake, that ending is unsatisfying. As soon as the Avengers attacked the Phoenix Five, things went downhill from there. At that point, it wasn't Avengers versus X-Men anymore. It was just Avengers and X-Men trying to save face. And by that standard, neither side ultimately won. Once provoked, the Phoenix Five grew increasingly unstable. While you could blame some of that on the Phoenix itself, the continued attacks by the Avengers, and even some X-Men who changed sides, really didn't help. It led to Wakanda getting decimated by Namor. It led to multiple Avengers being captured and imprisoned. It even leads to some major tension between Cyclops and Emma Frost, who would ultimately break up as a result of this event. As the fighting continued, parts of the Phoenix Force started vacating their hosts. Namor is the first to lose his piece. Magik and Colossus follow suit. And each time someone lost their piece of the Phoenix, it transferred to the remaining hosts, further intensifying their power and all the corrupting effects that come with it. In the midst of all this fighting, the Avengers are still searching for a solution. And once again, it came back to Hope Summers. They try to figure out how she's going to help them end this. They even get the Scarlet Witch involved once more, giving her a chance to further her redemption. It still comes far too late to save the story, but when their plan eventually does materialize, it does very little to vindicate the Avengers' actions to this point. That's not to say it vindicates the X-Men, but that's more a byproduct of glaring plot holes than anything else. Eventually, it all comes back to Cyclops, who's been fighting to save the mutant race since M-Day. He's the one who eventually ends up with the entire Phoenix Force, which required him to turn on Emma Frost after learning of an earlier betrayal between her and Namor. But again, becoming the full Phoenix doesn't mean he was automatically corrupted. At this point in the story, he's being attacked constantly by the Avengers, by his fellow X-Men, by his own girlfriend, and it all eventually comes to a head when he's confronted by his former teacher and mentor, Charles Xavier. It's not a peaceful confrontation, and at no point does Xavier attempt to calmly and compassionately reach his student, something he readily did for Jean Grey when she wielded the Phoenix Force. He just kept on attacking him. At one point, he even says, "Down, boy," as though Cyclops is a disobedient dog. And that's supposed to get him to stand down? The end result is painfully predictable. Cyclops, in his overpowered state, kills Charles Xavier. It's framed as this horrific moment of a student killing his former teacher and father figure. But honestly, it came off as both predictable and even a little justified. Remember, and this is worth belaboring, he was being attacked. He and the rest of the Phoenix Five were provoked. Seriously, what the fuck did they think was going to happen? Again, that is not a rhetorical question. And after this fateful moment, the final outcome just feels so muted. Cyclops goes full Dark Phoenix, Avengers and X-Men alike team up to stop him, and eventually, Hope Summers is finally able to fulfill her purpose. She takes the Phoenix Force from Cyclops and, with help from the Scarlet Witch, they quote-unquote destroy the Phoenix. That act even has the added bonus of undoing Wanda's spell. Finally, the mutant population is saved and can grow once more. In terms of resolutions, it has the necessary result. The Phoenix is gone, albeit temporarily. Mutants are no longer doomed to extinction, and the Avengers and X-Men can finally stop fighting. But again, take a step back and look at the bigger picture. This resolution basically had Hope do exactly what the X-Men wanted her to do to begin with. Take the Phoenix and fix the mutant race. Now you could argue that it might not have worked as well without Wanda. But then again, what was the alternative? Remember, we learned in the prelude comic X-Sanction that if Hope Summers didn't get the Phoenix Force, Earth would have been burnt to a crisp. So the Avengers basically won the day by helping the Phoenix do exactly what it was trying to do in the first place after they felt so hard to stop it. Confused? Yeah, join the club. You're not alone. And the aftermath of Avengers vs. X-Men did little to change that. And the full legacy of this story has only gotten worse with age. In the months and years following Avengers vs. X-Men, a certain sentiment emerged among fans. For X-Men fans, it manifested in a common meme that said Cyclops was right. Because, in the grand scheme of things, he kind of was. He believed the Phoenix was coming to Earth to save the mutant race. He also believed that Hope Summers was part of that plan. And he was right. The end results and the surrounding details leave little room for dispute. Mutants were able to manifest and thrive again because of Hope Summers and the Phoenix Force. For the Avengers, though, the aftermath was a lot less remarkable. They just couldn't move on from this story fast enough. Sure, they mourned the death of Charles Xavier, and they gladly participated in every effort to condemn Cyclops for his actions, ignoring mostly the role they played in those actions. Now, in their defense, the Avengers did become more proactive when it came to mutant affairs. They even built a new team around the mutants called the Unity Squad. And in various other stories, they teamed up with mutants more often, helping people see mutants more as heroes than freaks. But there was never a sense that this was a lesson they'd learned from Avengers vs. X-Men. There's never even a sense that they were at least somewhat responsible for how things played out. The Avengers just went back to being celebrated heroes, whereas Cyclops went to prison, and for years afterwards, he was scorned and vilified for killing Xavier. Never mind the fact that Xavier has been killed before, and by other X-Men no less. Never mind the fact that other characters like Wolverine have killed plenty of people, and without the corrupting influence of the Phoenix Force. The problem is someone just had to get the blame for Avengers vs. X-Men, and that someone was Cyclops. But given how the story played out, and all the complications and plot holes that came with it, it just never felt right. In fact, Cyclops actually became a lot more popular after this event. Nobody from the Avengers ever went out of their way to explain or justify their actions. There were also no retcons or revelations to give greater context to their decisions. To date, the overall details of Avengers vs. X-Men haven't really changed. The Avengers fought the X-Men over the Phoenix Force and Hope Summers. Cyclops believed both were necessary to save the mutant race. And he was right. The Avengers never presented him or anyone else with an alternative recourse. The only plan they ever had was to just fight. And that's a big part of why Avengers vs. X-Men is just so frustrating. These two iconic franchises fought for such dumb, misguided reasons. And by the time the story was over, there's a real sense that the fighting wasn't even necessary. It wasn't like Civil War in which both sides had real merit. In Avengers vs. X-Men, one side was completely vindicated. The other just got in the way. And in doing so, they also revealed that even superheroes can't see the force from the trees at times. Sure, they'll fight to save the day and save innocent lives. But when something comes along to radically change the world like the Phoenix Five did, they'll fight that too. And in that sense, they didn't save the day. They just preserved the status quo, one in which they're still the heroes. Whereas someone like Cyclops goes to prison. For a story about two iconic teams of heroes fighting, that's a very unheroic overview to say the least. Neither side did much to confront these aspects of the conflict. And both were all too eager to forget Avengers vs. X-Men and go back to being traditional heroes as they've always been. It might have been for the best, at least in terms of mitigating the damage done by this event, but it didn't make the overall story any less disappointing. In the world of superhero comics, the strength of any major crossover event is measured by its lasting impact. Like I said earlier, Civil War had a huge impact on the comic industry. Even though many of the effects of that story were ultimately retconned, it's still held in high regard among fans. The same is true for other stories like Watchmen, the Phoenix Saga, DC's Crisis, and Age of Ultron. But for Avengers vs. X-Men, its impact and legacy have always been mixed at best. Among fans of both franchises, you won't find many who consider it iconic or a must-read. For the most part, it's seen as this ambitious spectacle that started out strong, seriously faltered, and never fully recovered. It gave us some really epic hero versus hero battles, as well as some stunning artwork, but not much else. For me personally, I was deeply disappointed by Avengers vs. X-Men. When it first came out, I considered it one of the most disappointing events Marvel ever produced. Now since then, I have softened my opinion somewhat. It's still a horribly flawed story. I'd never recommend it to someone just getting into comics, but it has a few decent moments, most of which are at the beginning. It's also a story that I feel did a disservice to superheroes in general. It framed heroes like the Avengers as willing to save the day, but unwilling to change anything that might reduce the need to save it so often. They'll see the Phoenix Five as a threat on par with Ultron or Kang the Conqueror. And they never stop to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they're provoking some of the conflict that they ultimately have to stop. It doesn't just make them lousy heroes, it undermines the very merit of being a superhero in the first place. I also believe that Avengers vs. X-Men demonstrates just how difficult it is to tell a coherent hero versus hero story. It's one thing to have two superhero teams fight one another. It's quite another to have them fight for a compelling, understandable reason, one in which both sides have real merit. If nothing else, it proved that Civil War was an anomaly, and having heroes clash regularly is not healthy for the genre, or any franchise involved. Granted, that didn't stop Marvel from making a sequel to Civil War, or telling an even more lopsided superhero clash with Inhumans vs. X-Men. But at the very least, Avengers vs. X-Men shows just how badly these stories can play out if there isn't a coherent plan. And if writers and editors aren't careful, they can make even their most heroic characters come off as misguided assholes. And as a longtime fan of the Avengers, X-Men, and comic books in general, I say our favorite superheroes deserve better. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, take care and stay safe.